Hello and welcome to another episode of Handloader TV with me, your host, Jeremiah. And in this episode we're going to be talking all about the 10mm auto cartridge and the SIG P320 we have before us today. But before we dive into that or the details of that, let's go ahead and start out with a little bit of a brief history on the cartridge, the 10mm auto, because it is really interesting. Colonel Jeff Cooper is oftentimes credited with the creation of the 10mm, and I think a lot of that is justified. He had a big hand in the development of it, and he possibly more importantly had a really big hand in being able to promote and market the cartridge itself. Now, in his own book, Cooper on Handguns, he credited a man named Whit Collins with designing the 10mm auto. And lots of experimenting was done initially by taking, I believe it was 30 Remington cases and cutting them down to .990 inches in length. And then they were loading them with what I believe was Herter's .40 caliber bullets at the time. And many different powders were experimented with and tried. And ultimately, Jeff Cooper settled on Unique as being one of his favorite powders. And I've had really good results with that powder in this cartridge as well. Now, at this point in time, the cartridge wasn't standardized. It was still a Wildcat cartridge. So two guys, a man by the name of Tom Dornis and Mike Dixon, went ahead and got the 10mm auto standardized. And before you know it, Norma Ammunition was making ammunition. And that ammo was renowned for being pretty hot stuff. I believe it was propelling a 180 grain projectile between 1,300 and 1,350 feet per second. So that's nothing to sneeze at. And that's a lot of power coming out of a semi-automatic handgun. Very, very cool, very interesting, rimless cartridge. And the 10mm actually saw a brief stint with the FPI as their standard issue service weapon, and it was chambered in 10mm. Now, this took place after a very famous FBI shootout, and there's a ton of history and lore and stuff about that. It's really quite a fascinating read, and I'd encourage you guys to check that out and read up on it for yourselves. But unfortunately, the 10mm was relatively short-lived with the FBI because their qualification scores plummeted due to the excessive recoil of the 10mm. People were complaining about it. And so therefore what they went ahead and did is took the 10mm and they reduced the powder charge, and that's where you get the term the FBI light load. They significantly reduced it, and with a reduced powder charge, they didn't need this long case. They didn't need all the powder capacity. So what they wound up doing is cutting the case down, and thus was born the .40 Smith & Wesson. So really interesting that we get the .40 Smith & Wesson from the 10mm auto. Now if you fast forward to present day, we have a lot of manufacturers that are actually offering 10mm auto handguns on the market today. Colt, Smith & Wesson, Glock, Springfield Armory, to name a few. And more recently, we have SIG. On May 6th of this year, 2022, I was actually attending the SIG Freedom Days down at the Ben Avery Shooting Complex, and that's where I first saw this 10mm SIG P320. And it was really neat. I got to shoot it, and I went back in line and shot it again. And after that, I said, I got to get my hands on one. And about a week after that, they managed to get one into my hands. And let's take a closer look at the gun we have before us today. So I think the SIG P320 chambered in 10mm auto has been something that has been long awaited, and we'll go ahead and take a closer look at it and walk you through some of the features and distinctions about this particular firearm. So taking a look at the grip frame, according to SIG, they designed it from the ground up, and it has a higher beaver tail, an undercut trigger here, a beveled magwell, and some very nice grip texturing on it. Now from what I understand, according to SIG, this should be interchangeable with the 45 ACP grip modules as well, but without having one on hand, I really can't verify that claim. The mag release can be switched from the left side to the right side if so desired. It comes on the left side from the factory. It has front and rear cocking serrations on the slide, and we have their X-Ray 3 day and night sights, which are dovetailed in place. Also, the slide is cut for optics, and it will fit a Trijicon RMR or a SIG Romeo 2 red dot sight, or any optics that share that footprint. This is a very nice feature out of the box, and I'm very excited to test this out at a future date. It features a 5-inch bull barrel, M1913 Picatinny rail for attaching lights, lasers, or whatever accessories you may so desire. It came with 2 magazines out of the box in a plastic hardshell case, which was nice. And the magazine holds 15 rounds plus 1 in the chamber of the gun. So very respectable capacity out of this particular firearm for a 10mm auto. Rolling right along here. The overall length of the firearm is 8.5 inches. The width at its widest point is 1.3 inches, and the height is 5.6 inches. The weight unloaded is 2 pounds 1 ounce on this particular firearm. It is a striker-fired handgun, and if you look at it, it does in fact lack a manual safety. But we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this video. So if I want to go ahead and field strip this gun, it's a really simple operation. I will remove the magazine here and lock the slide. Of course, it is clear. We've checked it multiple times. Then what I'll go ahead and do is rotate this lever all the way down here, like so. And then you simply drop the slide, and now your frame is separated from your slide. You can remove the captured recoil spring and guide rod, and then from there you can simply pull your barrel out. And this is a pretty heavy contour barrel for a handgun. SIG calls it a bull barrel, 5 inches in length. To reassemble, drop your barrel back in, slide your recoil and guide rod assembly back in, give it a little bit, helps if you put it in the right way. There we go. Now that will, but that is nice to know that it will not go in the other way, so you really can't assemble it incorrectly. Next, you'll go ahead and slide the slide onto the frame, lock it to the rear. You're going to rotate this guy back, drop your slide, clear, function test, and you're good to go. So a really simple operation there. And overall, the gun feels pretty nice in my hands. I'm put probably somewhere around 200 rounds at the time of this filming, so I've got a relatively good feel for how the gun is doing, and as you can see from my hands, it's got a lot of carbon in it still. It's pretty dirty. I've put the ammunition through it. Another thing I always like to check with these particular handguns is the magazine release. And again, clear, mag's empty. It drops free very nicely. It is very positive. And one little side note I should note, this slide stop here on the gun, when I'm shooting it, on occasion I'll have that thumb a little bit too high, and I'll depress that and I'll prevent the slide from locking to the rear on the last round. But I slightly modify my grip, lower that thumb, and it works pretty good for me. So overall, so far, initial impressions of the SIG are very good. It ran very well. I did have a couple of failure to feeds, failure to ejects, but I think a lot of that might have been the magazine springs needing to be broken in, or possibly the recoil spring itself. But we're going to run some hand loads through it and see how it does. I almost forgot to mention the trigger pull. Now, on an average of 5 pulls on this Wheeler Engineering trigger pull gauge, it broke pretty cleanly, pretty crisply at 4 pounds 5 ounces. So this gun does have a really nice trigger. And the reset is pretty nice too. And of course, it's still clear. So feeling that trigger, little bit of creep and boom. The reset, very short, right there. A little bit of take up, a little bit of creep, and it breaks very nicely. Very lightly, 4 pounds, 5 ounces. Overall, I think it's a really nice trigger. So let's go ahead and walk you through the hand loading process that we use to develop all of our loads. So before we dive too deep into the hand loading stuff, there's one other thing I really want to point out to you guys, and that has to do with our barrel of our SIG P320 chambered in 10mm. Now upon examining numerous barrels that are chambered for 10mm, I have found that not all barrels are created equal. Now this one is a nice thick contour barrel. They call it a bull barrel again. But what we're going to be talking about is the chamber here. So I have a dummy cartridge here loaded up to the same specifications that I'll be loading my hand loads to. And we're going to go ahead and drop this guy into the chamber there. Now pay careful attention to see how deep that cartridge has seated into that chamber. You'll find that on certain other 10mm barrels, these chambers are not fully supported. This is what I would call a fully supported chamber. Now in a partially supported chamber, that case might stick out a little bit, something like that, or exaggerating it, that case would be sticking out of the chamber. And in particular, around the feed ramp and that area, that actual case wall would be exposed. Unlike this one, where the case wall is pretty much fully supported. The only thing exposed is the rim of the case where the extractor will grab and extract that case. So a very nice fully supported chamber on this SIG P320, which means we should have zero issues with case head separations, even with some of the hottest loads out there. So on that note, we've gone ahead and selected redding dies for all of our reloading dies needs in this video. It is a 3-die set, and it is a combination set, so it will load 10mm and 40 Smith & Wesson. We've gone ahead and selected Starline cases for all of our testing. I've found them to be of exceptional quality, and they particularly do very well when you're loading up hot 10mm loads. We also have a little bit of factory ammo to try, some really good premium bullets to test out, and a wide variety of powders. Now, we're going to be doing a ton of load development with this particular handgun, and we won't be able to show all the loads that we load up. In this video, we'll only be showing you the best results that we get. So I would encourage you guys to head on over to www.loaddata.com and type Handloader TV into the search bar and look for the 10mm auto loads. There should be 2 of them, and one of them will be using this SIG P320 in there. So go ahead and check that out for yourselves, and then you can see the good, the bad, and the ugly, along with the group sizes and velocity. The only thing you won't be able to see is the powder charges. Those are reserved for subscribers. And if you want to subscribe, it's a great way to help support the channel, and you get a ton of great load data. So let's go ahead and walk you through step by step what I did to develop these loads. We're going to do it kind of quick, and we're going to spare you the pain of dispensing powder and priming cases. I'll just tell you what I did for those steps. So first up, I have my sizing die. I've screwed it down until it contacts the shell holder. And I went ahead, since it is a carbide sizing die, no lubricant is required, I went ahead and full length sized all of my cases. And I did this just to kind of knock out any dents or anything like that that might have been in the case. These are brand new cases, but I ordered them in bulk, so they have a tendency to get dinged and messed up. And it's also a good way to remove the anti-corrosion compound that is put on these Starline cases. Alright, so now that we've gone ahead and sized all of our cases, the next step would be to go ahead and rotate the turret head over to our expanding die, which I have pretty much preset here. I will go ahead and run this case up into the sizing die, and as we can see, my bullet pretty much fits very nicely in there. We'll go ahead and run it down just a little bit more to put a little bit more flare on that case mouth. But you don't want to over flare your case mouth. Now, a lot of people talk about over flaring the case mouth, shortening case life. But to be honest with you, my main concern is not so much the case life as it is that case wall tension on that bullet. If you over flare it, over expand it, you're going to lose some of that tension, and you're not going to get that back with the crimping process as much as you would think. So I expand it just enough to where that will seat a bullet like this. And in case you were wondering, the measurement that I used for all of our load development for the case mouth once it's expanded is 422 thousandths of an inch. So that bullet fits pretty good. The next step would be go ahead and prime our cases. For that, I used a Frankfurt Arsenal hand priming tool. It has an adjustable wheel on there to kind of adjust your seating depth, which I kind of like. And primers were seated slightly below flush by a few thousandths of an inch on the primer pocket there. And then from there, once the case is primed, I'd go ahead and charge it using the RCBS Matchmaster scale and powder dispenser, and all charges were accurate to 4/100ths of a grain. So once the case is charged, I would go ahead and seat a bullet. So I'd place this bullet up here on our would-be primed and charged case, get it on there as straight as I can eyeball it, and then I would run it up into the die. And there we have it. And depending on the particular bullet I was loading, it should be, the overall loaded length should be between 1.250 inches and 1.260 inches, if my memory serves me correctly. But we'll have all that information in the target review at the end of this video. So once I went ahead and loaded up all of my ammunition, seated all my bullets, the final step would be to apply a taper crimp. So I will go ahead and just remove, for simplicity's sake, the seating stem on this die. Screw that out, remove it, and then I would back out the die a few turns, run the die down until it contacts the case with the ram in the highest position, raised up into the die. And then I would screw that die in about a quarter turn. And from there, I should get a really nice taper crimp. And it really is as simple as that when it comes to loading 10mm auto. And the crimp is a very important step. You want at least a medium taper crimp applied to all of your cases, because otherwise what can happen is that bullet can shift under recoil, or during feeding it can become set back in the case, and that can drastically increase your pressures. So there you have it, a relatively simple operation. I've actually already preloaded all of my hand loads here to hit the range. So let's grab the gun, we'll hit the range and see what kind of results we can get. Also, before we go, we'll be using the Ransom International Master Series rest to conduct all of our load development for this video. I just feel that it provides an excellent gauge of the mechanical accuracy of the gun, and it also gives you a good idea for what the recoil is, a lot better than my hands will do, and it saves us a lot of time. But fear not, I'll be putting a lot of rounds behind the gun with it in my hands, not just in the rest. So let's go ahead and hit the range. Woo! 30 rounds just like that. Killed that one. So as you can see, we're out on the range now, and we have our SIG P320-X10 locked into the Ransom International Master Series handgun rest. Got the remote trigger assembly on there, and we've hand tightened these using the 2-finger method to where they are just snug, but not over tightened. I have found out that if you over tighten these, it can cause vertical stringing, and that's to be avoided. So we fired about 5-6 shots to settle it down. Settled in pretty nicely. I think we'll be able to get some really nice groups out of it. I'm excited to see how it does. The target is downrange at 15 yards as usual, so it's directly comparable to all of our other videos. We have an Ailer Model 35P chronograph set up 10 feet from the muzzle to record all of our velocities. We do have a little bit of cloud cover, but so far it hasn't failed us. If we have any issues, we'll switch on over to elaborate our chronograph. But I'm a big fan of the Ailer, so that's what we'll be using, provided we don't have any complications. And according to the Kestrel 5700 here, we're dealing with a little bit of wind here, not too bad, but it's about 1 to 4 miles per hour from about the 6 to the 5 o'clock position, we'll call it. And the temperature is 93 degrees Fahrenheit, altitude's 5,000 feet, humidity is 22%, and pressure is 25.20 in Hg. These little Kestrel units are very handy for that. So on that note, I think it's about time to start out our load development. I have a ton of different loads selected for today for testing. We'll dive right into it. Rolling right along. We're going to be using Hodgdon Longshot powder, an 8.8 grain charge with 180 grain nozzler, sporting handgun, jacketed hollow point bullet, Starline cases, Federal 150M primers, and our overall loaded length is 1.260 inches. So, release the slide, put a group downrange. And 5 shots just like that. I can't tell you what a difference the Ransom rest makes in load development. Just so much faster. Next up, accurate number 9 powder, a 13 grain charge with 180 grain Hornady XTP, Starline cases, Federal 150M primers, and our overall loaded length is 1.250 inches. See how they do. Next up is Shooter's World Major Pistol Powder, a 10.6 grain charge with 180 grain Spear Gold Dot bullet, Starline cases, Federal 150M primers, and our overall loaded length is 1.250 inches. Alright, let's see how this load performs. So we're locked and loaded. This load is using Aligned Power Pistol Powder, a 7.1 grain charge with a 200 grain Swift A-frame bullet, a personal favorite of mine. Starline cases, Federal 150M primers, and our overall loaded length is 1.250 inches. So let's go ahead and see if it groups. Next up, we're using accurate number 5 powder, an 8.6 grain charge with a 165 grain Federal Hydroshock bullet, Federal 150M primers, Starline cases, overall loaded length of 1.255 inches. Lock that guy in, and away we go. It's hard for me to tell from here, but it looks like a pretty good load to me. So we're back at the bench now, and we have the best groups we got of the day to review. Before we dive into that, don't forget to check out loaddata.com, Handloader TV, look for the 10mm loads with the SIG P320 on there. And also this gun and the loads here will also be the subject of an upcoming column in Handloader magazine, issue number 340. I'll be writing that, and there'll be a table in there featuring all of these loads as well. So on that note, let's go ahead and take a look at the first best load of the day. We were using Hodgdon Longshot powder, an 8.8 grain charge with 180 grain Nosler sporting handgun, jacketed hollow point, and really good standard deviations and extreme spreads there. And then the group size measured out to 1.12 inches. So not too bad if you ask me. Pretty happy with that. The next load we went ahead and tried is using accurate number 9 powder, a 13 grain charge, and this is just under an inch at 0.96 inches. And again, outstanding standard deviations and extreme spreads on this particular load. 180 grain Hornady XTP, a personal favorite bullet of mine. Then we went ahead and swapped over to the Shooter's World Major Pistol powder, a 10.6 grain charge, and one thing I should note about this particular powder, we tried several different loads with it, and all of them showed really good standard deviations and extreme spreads. This one's no exception with an extreme spread of only 9. The group measures out to 1.33 inches with the flyer and 0.65 inches without the flyer. And a quick little note that I noticed with these flyers, because we did get an occasional flyer. Almost always it was when we used the slide stop and dropped the slide, release the slide, sending it forward, and that first round would usually fly slightly different than the rest of them. And I noticed that in particular with the SIG Elite Performance factory ammunition as well. So just a little side note that if that was the first round of the group, that's potentially why it was a flyer. Then we went ahead and swapped over to Alliant Power Pistol Powder, a 7.1 grain charge with a 200 grain Swift A-frame bullet, a personal favorite bullet of mine. I've had great results with these. These are deep penetrating, they expand very uniformly and consistently, and would be a great option for a hunting bullet. We got that down to a 1.13 inch group, a pretty decent standard deviation and extreme spread, and a little caveat, if you will, with the Power Pistol powder. It produced unusually low velocities. This particular load should have been around 1,200, maybe 1,150 feet per second, and it was down in the 970s. So maybe just a really slow lot of power pistol that I was using. Not really sure what's going on there. Then the next and last hand load that we tried is using accurate number 5 powder, an 8.6 grain charge. Pretty good standard deviations and extreme spread, respectable velocity. Recoil was pretty mild on this load as well, and we got a group size of 0.71 inches. So overall, really good performance in my opinion from this 10mm. Maybe would have liked to see slightly smaller group sizes with it. However, when we checked the cardboard backing, because we place our targets in the same spot every time for each load, so at the end of the day we get an overall group. And the overall group I don't think exceeded 3.5 inches or so. So overall performance was really good out of this handgun. And last but not least, we did run some of this SIG Elite Performance ammunition through it, the full metal jacket. and it performed pretty well. We got a standard deviation of 19, an ES of 54, so not too shabby there, and you can see the group size for yourself. All in all, I think the results speak for themselves, and now you can get a rough idea of what you can expect performance and accuracy wise from these pistols. And I'll leave you with a final note when it comes to these extreme spreads and standard deviations. And doing my own testing and talking with some other companies and people out there, I've found that the recoil spring can actually have a great effect on your standard deviations and extreme spreads. So if they start climbing up, then it might be time to replace your recoil spring, or at least have it checked out. So on that note, that about covers this. Let's leave you with some final thoughts on the handgun. As always, I really think the results of our testing always speak for itself, but I do want to leave you with a few of my own personal thoughts on the handgun and just kind of give you a quick rundown of what I thought about putting 500-600 rounds through this particular SIG P320. And the first thing I want to mention about the gun is that it doesn't have a manual safety. Now that's not a big deal to me, keeping the gun in a good holster with good retention. I don't really worry about that too much. However, a lot of hunters are interested in the 10mm as for maybe a bear defense or something along those lines. And I could see hunters potentially wanting a manual safety on there, and hopefully that's something SIG will address with later models chambered in 10mm. The next thing that I should probably mention is when we first got the gun, it did have a couple of malfunctions, but then after that we put well over 500 rounds through it with no issues, no more failure to feeds or failure to ejects or anything like that. The gun ran flawlessly. So I think some of the springs there needed to be broken in a little bit, and we are clear here. The next thing was along that same line of breaking in springs, the slide stop here. If you wanted to actuate it with your thumb, it was pretty tough. I wound up using 2 thumbs while breaking it in, but now it's super smooth, super easy, nice and broke in. And again, the gun has about 500 rounds through it. The final point I want to leave with is the popularity of the 10mm auto cartridge seems to be on the rise as of lately. And I, for one, am personally happy about that. I think more options on the market is always great. And I think one of the reasons and the primary contributing factor to this is that a lot of hunters see the 10mm as a viable field carry option, whether it be to protect from bears or just have an all-around carry gun. And the 10mm suits that role very well. And for a while, you had a lot of guys carrying wheel guns and 357, 44 Magnum, stuff like that. And the 10mm might not be quite as powerful as a 44 Magnum. It's very comparable to 357 Magnum. And it's really hard to argue when you have 15 rounds in the magazine, plus 1 in the chamber potentially. So all in all, I think that definitely contributes to the popularity of it, and I, for one, am grateful. So on that note, we want to thank you so much for watching. We really do appreciate it. As always, if you liked what you saw, you learned something, give us a thumbs up, let us know. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you're notified when we post the next video. And last but not least, if you have any comments, personal experience with this gun or 10mm in general, we would love to hear from you. As we grow, it's getting more challenging to respond to every comment, but I do my best to read and respond to every one of those. So thank you so much, and we will catch you in the next episode.